everything might be becoming digital. Or, well, it might not. Thinking about the word digital, you might hear it every day and you might have a rough idea of what it means, but what is the digital really? Eugenia Ciapera, in her book Understanding New Media, introduces the popular idea of the digital as information or data encoded in numbers. The most common numerical system used is the binary code of 0 and 1. The digital is therefore information converted into a series of zeros and ones. Information such as, for instance, a name can be represented by any arbitrary combination of numbers. This might sound familiar, but it's important to note that this is just a vague outline of a complex concept with roots deep in history and at the complex foundations of contemporary computing. What does this even mean anyway? An arbitrary combination of numbers. Does that have anything to do with computers? If we carved numbers into stone tablets, is that still digital? If this does have to do with computers, then where does it store numbers? What's going on here? Well, to try and clear this up, let's start from the start. The word digit comes from the Latin digitus, which refers to fingers or toes when used in the act of counting. When we think about something being digital, what we're really talking about is something being represented conceptually as whole and discrete, rather than the messy complexity of reality. Georges Ifrat discusses this complexity in his discussion of numerical systems in the book, The Universal History of Computing. As humans, we haven't just come up with one system of numerical notation. Over the last 5,000 years, there have been many. So many that we can divide them into 3 separate categories. But what's really important is that while written language represents the complexity of spoken language to a degree, what's happening with numerical notation is something different. Numbers represent a much more ordered mode of thought, simplified and abstracted from reality. Think about a simple act of counting things. For instance, counting sheep. With each sheep we count, we aren't really reflecting on the complexities and specifics therein. We don't care if a sheep has all 4 legs, what color its wool is, or how much wool it's produced. We consider it as something discrete and cut out from the rest of the world. It is one sheep. Now, okay, I know this isn't really how you're meant to count sheep, but if you stick with me. Even more complicated than this is the concept of zero, which, by the way, didn't arise until more than 4,000 years after the first written systems of counting. Have you ever thought seriously about how weird it is that we use zero in our numerical system anyway? What does zero mean? Have you ever seen zero of something, felt zero? Going back to our sheep. If there are no sheep in a field and you were asked how many sheep you see, you might want to say 0. But is this true? Surely seeing 0 sheep isn't possible. Don't you simply mean that you don't see any sheep? 0 is a wonderfully complex notion, worth the 4,000 years of thought it took to produce. It is, according to Ifrat, a numerical concept and an arithmetical operator. As a real number, it is inversely equal to mathematical infinity, and simultaneously a member of the sets of integers, fractions, real numbers, complex numbers, and so on, from one generalization to the next. How many sheep are on your screen right now? Well, yeah, that's right, the inverse equal to mathematical infinity. While there's not enough time to go into the complete history now, the concept of 0 made its way into Western thought through Indian numerals and eventually through the advanced mathematics of the Islamic world in the 15th century. In the 13th century, the Roman Catholic Church banned the use of 0 and all Arabic numerals, either to reduce fraud or else because they feared losing their grip on education. This veto lasted for 200 years, but mathematicians simply continued using the system in secret, referring to it by the then Arabic word for 0, zafir, or as we would mispronounce it today, cipher. By the 1600s, however, the use of 0 was all but perfected, and our now familiar positional numerical system was in place. It wasn't long after that that talented mathematicians started trying to develop faster ways of completing the often tedious means that were necessary for computation. In the 17th century, when less than 3 generations before simply uttering the word 0 could have resulted in your excommunication from society, Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz put his incredible mathematical wisdom into practice in creating the step reckoner, a machine capable of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division using mechanical wheels. Leibniz's invention was incredible and could complete a range of mathematical functions, but Leibniz knew that there was also so much more potential for better computers. He championed the use of a binary numerical system, distinct from the base 10 system used by humans, where numerical values could be expressed using values corresponding to something being either there or not there. While we might think instinctively of an electronic switch or transistor, when we think about binary, there are so many more ways to build a binary computer. Indeed, this in turn inspired Charles Babbage, with the aid of Ada Lovelace, to develop plans for the analytical engine, a more advanced version of a mechanical computer that could receive programs and output values, taking inspiration from the form of a Jacquard loom. This computer would have used a binary system in the form of punched cards, where, for instance, a space on the card represented a 1 and no hole represented a 0. In 1834, the design was completed for the first true computer, complete with memory, a processor, input and output. However, the machine was never built and is still only really partially understood. However, Babbage and Lovelace's ideas were extremely important for a reason that would soon become apparent. Just prior to the Second World War, in 1936, Alan Turing published his famous paper on computable numbers, which outlined a working theory on which to base a binary computer. From this basis, a computer could be developed that could perform any computable algorithm. By computable algorithm here, I mean any recursive function, which is to say, a function or expression that is predicated on the value or property of one or more variables and can generate meaningful outcomes through repetition. Multiplication, for example, can be achieved through recursion. Instead of multiplying 5 by 2 to make 10, we could write a recursive algorithm that would continue to add 5 to 5 as many times as we like. 2 times to make 10. Turing made the case that any function that could be achieved this way by a human could also be achieved by a machine. It was precisely this understanding of recursive functions that made Turing such a formidable cryptographer and allowed him to save thousands of lives by decrypting the German Enigma machine from the theoretical birthplace of the modern computer at Bletchley Park, just outside of London. Taking inspiration from Lovelace, Babbage, Leibniz, Boole, and the history of algorithmic mathematics, Turing refined a pre-existing Polish machine, the Bomba, though not technically a computer, to run mechanical processes that sped up the decryption of otherwise unreadable German communications during the Second World War. To make it clear, this is a really big deal. To pick just 2 of the many reasons why, well, on the one hand, this is hugely important as a breakthrough for the future of designs of computers. Turing's contemporary and engineer Tommy Flowers was inspired by Turing's work in his design of the Colossus, the first programmable computer. John von Neumann also benefited immensely from Turing's work, and contemporary computers would not exist without it. Turing was able to, much like Leibniz, make short work of complex mathematics using wheels. Flowers and von Neumann's machines stored values using thermionic valves, sometimes called vacuum tubes. Where there was a high level of charge stored in the valve, this was referred to as a 1, and where there was a low level of stored charge, this is a 0. On the other hand, and more relevant to our purposes here, Turing's hypothesis, sometimes also referred to alongside the work of Alphonso Church as the Church-Turing hypothesis, enables us to understand that anything that can be broken down into a sufficiently abstract form in order to become computable can also be reproduced by a so-called Turing machine or universal computer, like the computers we use today. In Turing's day, this information was held as stored electrical charge in a huge glass bulbs, not dissimilar from a light bulb. But today, Integrated circuits and microchips have allowed for billions of microscopic devices serving the same function to function in a fraction of the space. In practical terms then, think about how TV shows, movies, and social media and music are all able to be expressed in computerized forms. This is because we can break down sounds, colors, images, movements, and even ideas into abstract forms that can, with sufficient computing power, be reconstructed in a way that, to us, doesn't seem that much different from the real thing. Think about this video you're watching, for instance. You aren't really hearing my voice or seeing my face. You're seeing and hearing the manipulation of electricity enacting the product of a recursive function, reconstructing me and my ideas and my intentions to you. Zeros and ones, then, aren't just as simple as the numbers that you learn as a child. They can mean and represent so much more, and yet all the while they are so distinctly different from the world around us. Our world never really works in such discrete ways as numbers. This distinction is often framed as the difference between the analog and the digital. Edward Tufte wrote of this, "The world is complex, dynamic, and multidimensional, while the paper is static and flat. How are we to represent the rich visual world of experience and measurement on mere flatland?" In a similar but more familiar vein, Sean Cubitt reflects on how, instead of tracking the real in the manner of a phonograph needle agitated by the vibrations of the air, digital devices sample ambient sound in discrete packages. Though the sampling rate is extremely fast and gives therefore a more accurate rendering of the realia recorded, there is inevitably a minute gap between samples which the digital recording can never fill, unlike analog, whose relatively sluggish response is nonetheless continuous rather than sampled. The digital then could be said to be quite simply the representation of concepts through numbers. But given the complexity and history of those numbers, as well as the character of experiencing sensations experienced by those numbers, does this make the digital any less complex? In an article published in 2006, Bernard Stiegler argued that through the growing popularity of digital devices, memory has become displaced from the bodies in which those memories originate. In this, memory serves to become part of a system of control of knowledge. In other words, your memories are formed with or alongside the technology that you offload your memories onto. Because of this, the thoughts you're capable of having are affected by the technology you use to construct the memories themselves. Stiegler uses the example of losing a mobile phone, and thereby losing the data stored on that device. If we extend this example a bit, moving past what Stiegler wrote, we can think of Apple's iCloud system, which enables users to store data in their bank of servers. It's possible to regain your lost memories if you pay Apple for the privilege of displacing them. If you agree to store your memories in California rather than in your own flesh, you can download them again, should they be lost. But then, only the things Apple allow you to store can be stored within this system, and you can only download them onto devices Apple permits. Wrapping up, I want to first say that I'm not entirely sure I agree with Stiegler's assessment of memory displacement being part of a system of knowledge control. I especially don't agree with the implicit assertion that human beings had more, or at least a different type of access to their memories prior to the advent of digital technology. Just because something is digitized, that makes it digital. I'll talk about this more in the next lecture, but I want you to consider just what we might mean when we talk about the difference between the digital and the analog. I want you to consider how much interplay there is between reality and computerized data. Test scores for A-level results are stored in databases. Sometimes they're even affected by algorithms, but that still has an enormous impact on the real lives of the people that they affect. To finish off, I want to think very briefly, as a metaphor, about a piece of technology called a DAC, or DAC, a digital to analog converter. These machines are used in high-end audio equipment to convert digital signals like those on CDs or MP3s or digital audio workstations back into the smooth fluctuations in energy levels to enable better communications between digital instruments like laptops and synthesizers into analog speaker systems. To me, it's worth bearing this little discussed DAC in mind when it comes to discussing the digital in reality. Things may be digitized, but they certainly won't stay that way. The German media theorist Friedrich Kittler famously wrote an article entitled, "There is no software." By this, he meant that all software is a set of manipulations of real materiality in the real world. And while we may think of this process as digital and discrete, measured and controlled, there's a lot more to it than that. In trying to answer what is the digital, we must remember that the digital has its roots in the human body, through our hands and fingers, through human history in the development of counting and numerical systems. It has its roots in religious doctrines and wars. The digital is an abstract concept, but it's also material, impacting everything today. How much do you think the digital affects your life? Do you think you can live without digital technology? Well, make sure to let me know in the comments. And thanks so much for watching.